It is a fantastic time to be having a conversation around the state of the African economy, especially in light of what's happening around the global economic profile. And we are delighted to have this conversation within the context of the Africa Pulse. You know, the Africa Pulse is a biannual analysis of near-term macroeconomic outlook for the region, published by the World Bank and IMF, around the World Bank IMF spring meetings. And we are delighted to have the chief economist for the bank focusing on Africa, Dr. Albert Zofak. Glad to have you, sir. Welcome on set.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you. Let me hit straight into it. The report, interestingly, comes at a time when the balance of risks facing the global economy is evolving quite considerably. We are seeing COVID-19 seems to be receding to the back burner, if I could say, but we have Russia and Ukraine precipitating new risks that we are now facing. I'm just curious to understand, first of all, how is this playing out as far as the World Bank's economic prospects for Africa are concerned in 2022?
Julian, first, I think it's important to underscore that in this very gloomy global context, Sub-Saharan Africa has exited the recession, the COVID-induced recession in 2021. We are projecting that the continent will grow by 4% in 2021. And this is 0.7 percentage point higher than our projections in October of last year. And I think this is important to underscore. This is a good news because the continent has resumed positive per capita growth. I think this is the good news. The less so good news coming out of our projections, Julian, is that economic growth in the region is expected to decelerate in 2022. We project that GDP would grow by 3.6% in 2022. This is 0.4 percentage point lower than 2021. And this captures the multiple challenges facing Africa prior to the Ukraine crisis, but difficulties that have been indeed exacerbated by this crisis.
Interesting introductory thoughts there, Dr. Albert Zofak. Let me just come back to something else. Now, despite the uncertainty, and you've really given what sounds to be like a very bullish outlook here, do you see any opportunities coming from the challenges we are now seeing around the surge in commodity prices thanks to the strife we are seeing between Russia and Ukraine?
Julian, let's be clear that the Ukraine crisis is likely to impact African economies. It's likely to impact African economies through a number of channels. One of them being the direct trade channel. A number of African countries, importing cereals from Ukraine and Russia. The other channel is the commodity price increase. That is certainly across the board. All commodities are increasing. Prices are increasing. The third important channel through which this crisis is affecting countries in Africa is the food price. The food price increase, fuel prices as well, and this is leading to headline inflation really on the rise across African countries. It's also likely that there would be a tightening of financial conditions globally, as countries in advance, as advanced economies actually, resume a normalization of their monetary policies, and there could be a reduction in financial flows into the region. That's clearly, potential ways through which this crisis can affect African economies. But it's quite clear to us as well, coming out of this analysis, Julian, that the co-movement of commodity prices across the board, it's also presenting opportunities for resource-rich countries in Africa, some of whom may actually be able to counterbalance the negative impact of the Ukraine crisis. And that's why, as a result, the impact on growth is not as high as could be feared. But the impact is going to be through, inflation, and it would certainly affect the most vulnerable populations, especially in our cities, as their consumption basket includes more imported food. So the impact is going to be through urban poverty, and certainly affecting populations that are just above the poverty line, and the risk is that they could actually be brought down to poverty. And this is really where there could be a risk of social strife, as these urban populations are certainly seeing their purchasing power considerably reduced.
Very interesting insights there on the pass-through effects around inflation and some of the opportunities which you're also seeing. Before I go to the next question, let me just remind our viewers that you can be part of this conversation by tweeting at World Bank Africa. The hashtag is Africa's Pulse. Let's hear from you. Drop your questions. We really want to get your insights and thoughts around what you're seeing as the balance of risks in the macroeconomic environment. Let me go to my next question. And the economic performance of sub-Saharan African countries is lagging behind that of other regions and pre-pandemic output trends. What policies should countries be implementing to regain pre-pandemic output or those of the commodity boom period?
Julian, it's quite clear that potential output for Africa would still be at 4% lower than pre-crisis levels in 2023. So we haven't caught up with the pre-pandemic potential output, while in advanced countries, they're likely to come back to the pre-COVID potential output in 2022. So that is certainly a challenge that African countries need to tackle. But as we know, this is certainly driven by the long-lasting effects of COVID-19. And it's important, one of the main messages of this Africa's Pulse is that the long-lasting effects of COVID-19 on our economies are probably what are driving the deceleration in growth, probably more than the Ukraine crisis itself, that may actually be canceled out because of commodity prices increase. So it is the case that COVID shock, climate change related shocks, such as droughts in the in the Horn of Africa, such as cyclones in the southern part of Africa, are posing a serious and long-term challenge to our, to the continent coming back to its growth potential pre-COVID-19. So what should countries do? We believe there are certainly three groups of policies that need to be implemented. And the first is going to be the kind of fiscal policies that can be implemented to contain the surge in prices. And this is challenging because most African countries are entering this order crisis with very limited fiscal space. So economies must find ways to certainly play with import duties on food, play with exemptions on foodstuffs that are imported. These are all measures that are important in the short term. And it is also important to really use our trade policy more wisely. It's essential not to ban export, for example, because actually, banning export worsen the effect of food shortage, not the other way around. So, dealing with proper and smarter trade policies would also be very, very important in the short term. Obviously, there could be use of monetary policy in some cases, but there is a word of caution there as we see stagflation as being one of the most important risks coming out of this episode.
Good point you're raising there. And maybe let me stay with the point of monetary policy, because one of the challenges central banks are grappling with right now in this region is the fact that on the one hand, you want an accommodative policy to support the post-crisis rebound. On the other hand, you have inflationary pressures and FX, foreign exchange depreciation coming away. How do you see them striking the balance when it comes to these risks they're facing?
Julian, one clear challenge facing central banks is that risk of stagflation. And it's a huge conundrum to central bankers. Do you stabilize inflation aggressively, or do you promote growth, right? And make sure countries actually reach that output potential or sustain that high growth of 2021 and further on. It's a real conundrum here. And what we have seen on the continent, Julian, is that central banks are going in different ways. 8 central banks on the continent have raised their interest rates, their base rates. 5 have actually lowered it. So what it tells is that depending on the situation, in specific countries, central banks may actually opt to sustain growth by not moving too aggressively with interest rates hikes. And that's very, very important. And this is actually crucial, and this discussion needs to be heard because, Julian, we do doubt of the efficiency of monetary policy to address inflation at this current time in Africa, because most of that inflation is from supply shocks. Monetary policy is known to be really effective to address demand-driven inflation, which is the case in the US, for example, but it may not be the case for African countries. So we should clearly avoid just replicating monetary policy that is applied in advanced countries.
Very spot on thoughts there. Let me circle back to your point around fiscal policy and the constrained fiscal space. Now, to address the rising risks of debt sustainability, countries in the region have implemented austerity measures, and many have benefited from the debt service suspension initiative, that's the DSSI. Will these actions be enough to reduce the debt levels and prevent more countries from falling into a distressed position?
First of all, Julian, let's be clear. None of the measures adopted so far at the global level has been able to address the rising debt issue in Africa, and even more importantly, address the issue of sustainability. The DSSI you mentioned was actually aiming at addressing liquidity issues, not solvability issues. So it's actually not clear why we should expect the DSSI to address the sustainability issue. It was just addressing the short-term liquidity constraint, creating a little fiscal space for countries to address the COVID-related shocks. So, that initiative has had a number of issues. But let me step back a little bit and say, as we discuss African debt, then 2 important issues that have to be on the table. First is that the structure of African debt has changed so much that we cannot discuss debt crisis in Africa as we were in 2000 or as we were talking about the HIPC. It's completely different, the structure. And the second is the nature of shocks has also changed. So in terms of debt structure, we are currently at a stage, Julian, where private creditors own the large majority of African debt, more than multilateral institutions such as World Bank, IMF, more than bilateral such as China and European countries. It is the case today that the structure of African debt has changed to the point that 2/3 of interest paid by African countries is due to private creditors. So that makes debt treatment and debt solution extremely complex because you have to bring all the key creditors around the table. In a country like Chad, the main creditor is a private company, Glencore. It's neither the IMF, nor the bank, nor the World Bank, nor China. It's a private company. So debt has changed in African countries, and the way to come up with solutions need to be completely different. So the DSSI has offered a couple of African countries the opportunity to suspend the payment of interest. But that was just a transitory solution. And the DSSI actually had three issues. One, not many African countries could actually benefit from it. Second, middle-income African countries with market access were not enthusiastic about it because they could be punished by rating agencies as they perceived this as the beginning of default. And third, it was difficult to bring private creditors around the table. So those issues are also present in the common framework that is being discussed. So, we need to come up with innovative solutions, and probably Africa needs to actually sit and start thinking, of solutions within the continent to address these issues, because the international community so far hasn't been able to actually put something very, very concrete on the table. The common framework has only 3 countries now on the discussion. It's Chad, is Ethiopia, and Zambia, right? So, this doesn't seem like the magic bullet to solve Africa's debt.
Speaking about innovative solutions, Doctor, if I could prod you maybe into something, there has been the conversation around the capability of deepening domestic markets such that we now shift away from the foreign currency denominated because of the risks associated. How do you think Africa, by and large, is faring when it comes to deepening local capital markets for domestic debt mobilization?
Julian, I think that's a very important point, and that touches on the need to come up with those innovative solutions. African financial markets or capital markets are certainly very shallow. And it is our hope that with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and reforms on financing and payment systems, that there could be more and more solutions that could lead to African countries actually raising debt domestically. We have already seen some regional bond markets quite active in West Africa, in East Africa, deepening those domestic capital markets, and ensuring that, financing conditions remain, affordable, not to worsen the issue of debt sustainability, are going to be key solutions moving forward.
Once again, let me remind all those joining us that you can be part of this conversation by tweeting at World Bank Africa. The hashtag is Africa's Pulse. Let's get to know your thoughts, be part of this conversation. These are issues affecting our day-to-day lives. Doctor, let me go back to the discussion around monetary policy. In the recent cycle of monetary policy committee meetings, we've seen a bit of divergence in monetary policy. And I'm just curious to know, in your view, do you see this divergence presenting a risk or a tailwind for the overall prospects of the region?
Julian, I think divergence in monetary policy, as we've discussed, is actually not a risk in itself, as we see, because we should expect central bankers to address problems facing their economies and not just mirroring whatever is happening in the neighboring countries or in the advanced economies. And that's actually a good thing, right? In countries, and let's be clear, inflation has been on the rise on the continent, right? Inflation has been on the rise even prior to the COVID crisis, right? We have seen an increase in inflation, from around 3.5% in 2020 to 4%, and it's likely to exceed 6% in 2022 across Africa in average. Of course, countries like Angola still have way higher debt, even entering entering COVID crisis, higher inflation entering COVID crisis, and now with the Ukraine crisis. So depending on the source of inflation, central bankers must use or must certainly adjust their policy stance. And it is crucial to ensure that that central banks who are facing a supply-driven inflation do not over-rely on monetary, on raising aggressively interest rates, because that could certainly jeopardize the recovery of the economy and threaten job creation in our countries. So it is actually not a risk in itself, but it calls on central bankers to use wisely the monetary policy tool. And it also calls on other authorities of economic policy to wisely use fiscal policy, especially for the short term. But ultimately, Julian, the solution to these shocks and to the volatility facing our economies, the long-term solution is in the structural change that our economies must undergo. The solution is in economic transformation in the long run. And one basic way to do it, as prices increase and the demand for African commodities increase, and this could actually further increase following the sanction on Russia, is to really seize this opportunity to start adding value to our commodities before exporting them. And that would be a good way to kickstart that economic transformation that would lead to a larger share of employment and output from the industrial sector, from manufacturing, but also lead to more productive and high-paying jobs in our economies.
Clearly a need there for structural transformation. Doc, let me get into your crystal ball here. You sit in a pole position, you have got good visibility. Just how far do you see inflation rising? And why I'm asking that question is because we have a confluence of risk factors here. We've got supply side shocks, we've got imported inflation coming in, we've got foreign exchange also exerting some pressure. How far do you see inflation going?
Well, I do not have that crystal ball, Julian, but I would say it would depend on the nature of the shock, right? On the nature of the conflict now going on in Ukraine. If it's temporary, short-term, or if it leads to permanent changes in the structure of prices. If the shock is temporary and the conflict is, relatively brief, then we may expect inflation to peak at around 6-7% in 2023, then come down progressively to maybe 4% in 2024 and 2025. Probably we could be back to where we were in 2021. Now, if the crisis is prolonged and the shock becomes a little bit more permanent, then that is a matter of concern, and we'll have to blend both short-term policies with more investment to get to increase supply of those goods on the continent of Africa itself. Julian, one number that actually keeps me awake at night is Africa imports more than $40 billion of food every year while having the potential to be the breadbasket of the world. Probably this is an opportunity for Africa to actually step back and rethink our agriculture, boost its productivity, make it more technologically, enhanced, invest in irrigation to make sure our agriculture is no longer just relying on the rain, which is basically poverty.
Doc, the figure you've given is quite staggering as far as food imports are concerned. And I want to stay with that point you're raising there because let's talk a little bit about the labor market, because one of the things that COVID precipitated was a crisis in the continent's labor market where some jobs dried up entirely. I mean, how do you think Africa, with a vastly informal labor market, is coping with this reality of job creation?
Julian, you know, most of the the people in Africa actually draw their livelihood from agriculture, which is subsistence agriculture, and which is an agriculture that, again, has very low productivity and therefore generates very little income. And that's why subsistence agriculture is where 82% of the poor in Africa are. So subsistence agriculture in Africa has essentially produced poverty. So, you know, as we think of jobs in Africa, it's important to really concentrate on boosting productivity of agriculture so that more people can exit agriculture to move to more productive activities, essentially in urban areas. So investing in boosting productivity of agriculture would ensure that the fewer people remaining in agriculture are more productive and therefore escape poverty. Now, we also need to invest in our cities to allow them to be more productive as well. Currently, most African cities are congested, costly, and disconnected. So this does not create the right environment for the private sector to create those jobs, those productive jobs that are desperately needed. So we need to invest in our cities as well, create the right infrastructure, physical and digital infrastructure to allow African cities to be more productive and to become the cradle of job creation, the cradle of innovation, which they are not now. Instead, what we have is, a sprawling informal sector that actually hosts a lot of people who are vulnerable to these economic shocks and who may be the most affected by this Ukraine crisis, as their purchasing power is going to be affected by inflation in cities. So, thinking of a job agenda in Africa, we believe our countries need to invest in innovation, in technology, including, especially in agriculture, to boost productivity. Our countries need to add value to our commodities before exporting them, therefore increasing the potential for productive job creations and increasing, Africa's share in global trade. We think it's important to invest in cities, invest in urbanization to make our cities more productive. But linking those rural and urban spaces with effective infrastructure is going to be crucial as well. Investing in skills and human capital is going to be crucial, but more importantly, building strong institutions, Julian, holds the key to long-term economic transformation. And when we say strong institutions, I'm thinking of institutions to manage your macroeconomy, right? Strong central banks, strong, fiscal policy, institutes to actually craft the right kind of policies to keep the macroeconomic stable, right? Then you need institutions for good governance and accountability that would allow our economies to, to function more effectively, to create the fiscal space necessary from our own resources to do those investments.
Dr. Albert, I speak often to policymakers across East Africa, and speaking about the challenge of the vast and sprawling informal economy, they'll tell you that one of the challenges they face is that any attempt to formalize this vastly informal economy is met with resistance because of the perception that this will be an avenue of getting us into the tax net, and it means more tax burden. Do you see this as a huge challenge, and maybe what would you recommend?
Julian, I think the issue of the informal sector in Africa is one that needs to be addressed with a lot of, tact. I think the issue is not formalizing the informal sector. The issue is creating the conditions for small informal activities to grow. And when they grow, they cannot escape the radar. So the question, the more important question is, what should African countries do to ensure growth of small, medium-sized enterprises that may be in the informal sector, but that are just yearning for help to actually grow and create more jobs. Instead, the approach of fiscalizing and just seeing informal activities as just an additional source of taxation is actually counterproductive. It's leading to tax evasion. It's leading to, leading to a very important fact, which is the lack of growth in small entities, small enterprises in Africa. African firms have the smallest size of all regions of the world. We need to start thinking how to make our firms grow instead of just thinking of fiscalizing the informal sector.
Very important nuggets there. Let me get to the tail end of our conversation. And one of the sweet spots in this Africa Pulse report is basically the focus on social safety nets. And let's start from here. I mean, the report speaks extensively about the need for social protection safety nets as Africa pursues greater resilience. Now, in a continent, and maybe we've already touched on this, in a continent where the bulk of the labor force is in the informal economy without structured terms, how do you envision the issue of social safety nets for the masses being addressed?
Julian, I think one of the most important message of this Africa Pulse is that social protection, social safety net must be part of any economic transformation plan for countries. Why? Because economic exclusion is likely to generate civil unrest. It's likely to generate political instability that could counter all the efforts that are being implemented. And we're seeing a number of those situations across the continent. So it's crucial that we seize this opportunity. And COVID has actually shown how we can innovate to deliver more social protections to populations in need. And we have harnessed technology, we have harnessed the digital to actually deliver social protection better during COVID. The question now is, what kind of social protection do we need moving forward in Africa to really face all these increasingly complex shocks and challenges? This issue of the Africa Pulse is arguing, Julian, that we need to think of social protection in a broader context, going beyond the simple, social assistance through cash transfer, to really start thinking of adaptive social protection mechanism, but also thinking in terms of promoting economic transformation as a way to boost resilience of our economies. So this issue of the Africa Pulse is discussing different tools that African countries can actually, use to create the kind of social protection that would address vulnerability of populations in urban areas, essentially in the informal sector, who are not covered, right? Only 8% of workers are covered by a formal social protection mechanism across sub-Saharan Africa. That's really small. So it is crucial to really start thinking of innovative ways to expand social protection through, providing, activities that can actually generate income, linking those cash transfers to education and health, for example, and essentially using social protection as a mechanism to bring back people who are excluded in the economic system. And that is essentially what we are promoting here.
I like that, tabling the case for wider inclusion in social safety net. Let me get to my final question. Now, the report identifies the need to enhance financing to boost social protection in Africa. Now, given the fiscal constraints we have already spoken about, and the fact that if you look at the global environment right now, we're seeing some tightening conditions from a financing standpoint. How do you see African governments being able to realize this?
That's a very, very important question, Julian. And just to start, currently, in average, 55% of resources in social protection in Africa are actually coming from abroad. So basically, in average, only 45% is funded through our own budgets. And in countries that are more fragile, such as Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Malawi, and others, close to 100% of all the resources put in social protections are coming from abroad. Well, if we agree, Julian, that fighting economic exclusion is crucial for economic transformation, then we need to be able to start investing ourselves some of our resources into fighting economic exclusion. Now, you're absolutely right. We're in a context where fiscal space is absolutely, small, right? We're facing huge fiscal constraints. How do we do this? Well, the first thing to say is it's going to be less and less likely that more resources will flow from outside into Africa. We have seen a tendential decline in ODA, in overseas development assistance, over the years. And Julian, as you probably know, that as of today, remittances of African diaspora are higher than overseas development assistance, which is called aid, right? So I think it's important that we make that shift already in our mindset, that the financing of our economies would have to be generated from within. So that's important. And how do you generate that from within? I think there's one area we don't speak so much about, which is the efficiency gains that we can have in our public expenditure. These are lost revenues that we can actually use to finance our economies, finance our infrastructure, finance our education and health, finance our access to electricity and digital, finance our social protection. We can generate more efficiency gains. We can generate more revenue from better management of our public expenditure, especially our public investment program that is generally a source of a lot of leakages. So tightening the way we manage our public expenditure, fighting corruption, bringing more accountability in the systems will definitely, avail number of resources for African economies to actually invest in those crucial aspects of our economic transformation. But we must also fight illicit capital flows. We must also use sparingly fiscal incentives and link those to employment creation, instead of blanket checks that are cut to firms that actually do not invest. So it is important to really start thinking of ways to generate those resources to invest in social protection, but most importantly, in our infrastructure and all the aspects of transformation of our economies.
Dr. Albert Zofak, I wish we had more time for this conversation just to unpack the detail of this very resourceful report. Unfortunately, that's why we have to close this conversation focusing on the Africa Pulse. And we still welcome your thoughts on social media at World Bank Africa, hashtag Africa's Pulse. Let's get this conversation going. Let's get to know what your thoughts are.
Thank you so much, Julian, for having me here.
I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Okay.